Hello, Miss Lepender. I hope you're having a wonderful day so far. And without wasting time, let's just jump right into my notebook. So this first slide introduces the family tree and timeline. And this is one of the first things I had after reading the story because I think it's super important to have a baseline understanding of how things chronologically line up in the family tree because obviously Andaje does not chronologically order his memoir. And in a lot of cases, it can be extremely difficult to understand what is happening from character perspectives. So I use this as a baseline to kind of get myself started when looking at the story. On this next slide, I have what is the prep notes for our first reflection when I was the inquiry officer. Um, it was pretty difficult to sort of kind of jump into the book, I think, discussion wise. And being inquiry officer at first, it was hard to sort of figure out what kind of questions needed to be asked immediately in terms of analyzing Andaje. So, pardon the terrible handwriting, by the way. I'll read most of it out. I have questions like what themes do we see presented immediately in the first section? What techniques does Andaje use to emphasize this sort of dream as conscious writing? How does organization of subject and character rather than chronological order aid Andaje's journey? What are some of the major overarching themes we see throughout the next portion of the stories? Do anecdotal stories aid or tarnish the reliability of Andaje's storytelling? And I got a lot of good responses in the discussion from that one. And one of the other things I sort of brought up was that Ondaatje doesn't really tell everything from his just encounter with the story. He tells it as a story itself. And what does that do to Ondaatje's writing? And this was, I think, there were good questions to ask because it was hard to get a grasp on Ondaatje's writing at first. But once you got a sense for how he poetically wrote and wrote not just from the encounter but the actual story and used different perspectives, these questions were questions that you didn't really need to necessarily ask. You could already assume a lot of them and the questions were then based off of those assumptions. So this is from the second discussion we had with Haley and Catherine. And I really liked this because it helped me understand the story a lot better. And I think personally I do a lot better from reflection off of talking about things rather than prepping a ton and then talking about them. Asking questions and then reflecting is how I best analyze literature. So I really like this one because I came in with ideas about the poems that we see, like Sweet Like Crow, To Colombo, Women Like You, The Cinnamon Peeler, and I brought all of these up in the discussion. And it was it was easy to, as a group, sort of look at these poems and say, okay, what is Andaje doing? And that's why I included this, because I really like that I was able to reflect on it quite well and use what I learned throughout his specific poems in the second discussion to aid my further analysis of the craft Andaje uses when doing something like my passage analysis. So right here, I have this goes hand in hand with the next discussion. A quick little jot I did of Mervyn at this point because he's an interesting character, and I think it was important to recognize how Mervyn interacted with Andaje as his father, as undoubtedly one of the major sources for why he left Ceylon as a kid. So these are just some quick notes I jotted down before or after just this third discussion where we really talked about Mervyn's role in this memoir. So this is the third discussion reflection I did with Haley and Catherine, where I was the role of postmodernism, but we really talked a lot about what he's trying to say in the sections we discussed and using his father as a driving force for this memoir. It seemed like Andaje really needed to learn a lot about his family, accept things, and his father in these portions of the memoir were a driving force of that. And it seemed like Andaje really wanted to get something across about his father. So I really liked the discussion we had here, and it just it just aided a lot better to the understanding of how Andaje was using characters to further propel the memoir in a way that made you think about the relations to Andaje and these characters rather than just blatantly stating who these characters were. So I also included here the quote passage analysis for Andaje. Like I said, I think reflecting and writing after a fact is much easier for me to piece things together. So I really liked that we did a quote analysis at the beginning of this unit because it made it a lot easier for me to break down how Andage piece by piece writes. And so I just really enjoyed being able to do this quote analysis, and it just aided in my eventual writing of Andage in terms of passages. So this also goes hand in hand with the next and final slide. These two parts of the SCSI notes that I took, I think, again, reflection, writing down, really made it easier to look at Andage's writing. So I wrote down the action and the style, and that was good for me because I was looking, as we see, what is literally happening, what is metaphorically happening, and it wasn't up until this point that I hadn't realized that Andage uses a ton of metaphors, like a lot of metaphors in his writing. And when we did this passage about Lala, which is an extreme metaphor, an extreme magical realism of the event of Lala dying, it really clicked with me that wow, he uses a lot of metaphors and how his writing is shaped around these metaphors to really bring across an idea that he doesn't necessarily want to blatantly say, because for him it wasn't that easy either. It took time. And with style as well, it was nice because I got to specifically look at what are the things he's doing, and these things were present in a lot of other places in his writing. So this SCSI action and style notes were really important for me in understanding how to better look at Andage's, well, metaphorical and stylistic choices. And finally, we have what was my SCSI setting paragraph. And this is important because this is what eventually set me up for my SCSI passage analysis, the entire SCSI passage analysis for our essay on running the family. And I've said it once, said it a million times, writing and reflecting really aids in me seeing the bigger picture after the fact. So after writing this, I really recognized how he uses setting to eventually set up these metaphorical situations in his writing and aids the memoir. So for me, writing this setting paragraph was really important because after the fact, and as I was writing my new passage analysis, I really started to see the dots connect in his writing with how setting is such a huge part in this memoir. And not just in terms of the physical, but in terms of the emotional and metaphorical. So those are all 8 of my slides for this notebook. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you very much, Ms. Labrador.